Hello, welcome back to Authors on iTours. And today we have a fascinating interview with D.H. Morris, the author of The Girl of Many Crowns, which is on tours with Irie Book Tours. The Girl of Many Crowns is a true and inspiring story of a powerful knight and a runaway queen who unite to defy an empire. If you love historical fiction or romance or action and adventure, then you're going to want to stick around for this interview. D.H. Morris has lived in 4 continents and traveled through many countries. She has 4 children and 11 grandchildren, and she currently lives in Kansas City, Missouri. She graduated from Utah State University with a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Theatre and Choral Music Education, and she pursued graduate work in English at USU and law at the University of Utah. She is also a published playwright. As a descendant of our protagonists in The Girl of Many Crowns, the author discovered their intriguing story while doing a genealogical project. This journey inspired her to research everything about the 9th century, including food, politics, travel, war, education, clothing, jewelry, religion, holidays, marriage customs, and medicine. She loves talking about this remarkable time in history in the European countries we know today were being formed and fighting for their very existence. And that is what our interview with DH is with today. So I encourage you to stick around to learn more about DH Morris and The Girl of Many Crowns. Hello, this is Lauren Carr, and welcome to Authors on iTours, a podcast devoted to authors, book bloggers, and other book lovers alike. D.H. Morris, and you have a wonderful book that that's on tour right now, and it is historical fiction, but in a way it's historical based on facts. It is The Girl of Many Crowns, currently on tour with Irie Book Tours. So D.H., why don't you tell us a little bit about this fascinating story, which I understand is actually based on your ancestors?
It is based on an ancestor. This is the first princess of France, and her father marries her off at the age of 12 in a political alliance to a widower who is 50 years old. He is the King of Wessex. So she actually becomes the first anointed queen in England. We still have her coronation ceremony. And I used a translation of that in the book. And every queen since then, her coronation ceremony has been based on Judith's. Well, as a young girl, she becomes a widow, and then she's forced to marry again, and then she becomes a widow again by the age of 16. And her father wants her to marry again at his command. And she says no.
She's had enough with marriage.
That's where the conflict begins. And he locks her in the castle and says, you will never leave until you agree to marry at my command.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a true story based on the annals that were kept by the monks in the 9th century.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a fascinating story of a young woman who becomes queen twice in England.
But she certainly didn't have any power if the king could just say, marry her off at will.
That was women in those days. And also the sons. her younger brothers were forced to marry or by the king's command as well. The king had all the power, and he said what your future would be. So if you are 4 years old and you're the king's son and he doesn't see you in line to inherit the throne, chances are you will be sent to an abbey and you will be raised by the monks and you will become an abbot. Or if he doesn't see you as a potential daughter to marry off when you are 4 years old, you will also go to an abbey and raised to become an abbess. And
And
so
what is
you
that? Is that
had
kind of
no
like a
choice.
priest or a monk, or what is that?
Yes, they would be eventually the leader of the abbey. And the abbots had great power, and maybe they would even become a bishop or an archbishop if they were a man. They did have great power. They even had their own military forces, and they controlled a lot of money, and they were allies of the king. So the king was putting his children in specific places to increase his political standing so that he could protect his holdings in his kingdom. And
now,
Judith was
and
a
was
little
it
bit rebellious by the third time around.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, was it just this king, or was that, or you're talking about generally that's what the kings and the monarchy did back
Absolutely.
then?
Yeah, that is exactly what the kings did. And that tradition actually has continued to our day. And you saw Prince Charles being urged to marry Diana Spencer when he really wanted to marry Camilla. You saw the Princess of Japan, Princess Mako, in 2020. She had to leave the royal family in order to marry a commoner. It still exists today.
So just to build up their alliances.
Yes.
Now the girl of many crowns. That is set. This is set in the 9th century.
It is.
Could you describe what was your research process for capturing the accuracy of this time period? What sources did you find useful or surprising?
Well, research into the 9th century was challenging, especially since the monks, who were the historians of the day, seldom wrote about women unless they did something notorious or shocking. However, my research actually yielded a lot more information than I expected. I discovered that references to Judith, the female protagonist, were included in a number of different historical accounts of the day. The MGH is a series of historical volumes. It's actually Monumenta Germania Historica, and it's written in Latin and German. And it was written and kept from the end of the Roman Empire up until the 1500s in Latin and in German. And it really covered the history of Europe. And so that was a great resource. I was able to actually use a few of the actual conversations that were recorded in the book. But the outline for the book I took from the Annals of St. Bertin. St. Bertin is an abbey in what was Francia, now France. And the monks chronicled the major events of each year at the end of the year. So they kind of gave a summary. So I took 7 years out of that book, and I just went year by year. And I relied heavily upon the works of renowned early medieval scholars, such as Janet L. Nelson, who is British and a brilliant early medieval scholar, probably the premier one in the world. There are others also that I used. All in all, I read about 45 books or master's theses or treatises of various kinds about the 9th century because I didn't know anything about war, their holidays, um, their birthing process, the traveling, the food, everything. I had to research the jewelry. I really researched everything, the politics, and royalty, of course.
Encounter any gaps or ambiguities in the historical records when you were researching this period? Because that's such a long time ago, 9th century. So how long ago is that? And how did you navigate any of these challenges while writing The Girl of Many Crowns?
Well, you're right. It was a long time ago, 1,200 years ago.
Yeah.
And as far as ambiguities go, Judith was a very controversial figure. Some historians have been outraged that she stood up to her father
Mm-hmm.
and refused to marry a third time. Others find Judith to be a sympathetic figure and felt that perhaps neither of her first two marriages were consummated because she had no children from those two
I
marriages.
was going to ask that if she had any children from
Yeah,
these.
well, what I didn't tell you in my summary is when she was imprisoned in the palace, her brother's companion is a knight named Baldwin Ironarm,
Uh-huh.
and he helps her escape from the palace, and they are chased across Europe and they flee to the Pope to see if he will take their side and allow them to marry.
Ah,
So they actually are eventually married and become the founders of what is now Belgium.
oh, okay. Oh, all right. Okay.
So it's a fascinating story, but he is not royalty, and
Mm-hmm.
he was a count, the Count of Flanders. So she gave up her crowns in
Mm-hmm.
order to become a countess and marry the man that she loved.
Uh-huh. So it really is a romance, and these are your ancestors. They're in what you're a direct descendant of Judith,
Yes, yes.
and
It's
you
like
found this out while
31 generations. That's a long
so you can lay claim to the throne of France.
time. If I were 1,200 years ago, I might.
Well, now in
Uh,
the yeah, so
so
how
I
did you?
tried, oh,
Yeah.
sorry, I tried to look at what actions they did, what choices they made, where they ended up. And then I tried to fill in, okay, if this were me and I was married off at 12 to a 50-year-old man,
Hmm.
albeit he was a very kind man, um, and I was in this situation, what would I be doing at his death, or how would I live my life day to day when it comes to holidays? What holidays did they celebrate? How were they celebrated? Um, I found some amazing sources. One I particularly liked was the eyewitness account of an Easter celebration in Francia in
Yeah.
the middle of the 9th century. Perfect timing. And it perfectly described their Easter celebration and an Easter procession. And so I joyfully lifted that and used it in my book, and included even the song that they sang, the words that I found out on a Catholic website. I had to research Catholicism. I was not born a Catholic. I don't know a lot about Catholicism and the way they worshiped. So that was another aspect of my research. And I was very delighted to find something that fit perfectly into my book.
Mm-hmm. In your book now, because you were talking about Judith and Baldwin, in writing The Girl of Many Crowns, did you emphasize the personal stories of these characters, or are you actually more focused on the larger historical events and the accuracies, or how do you balance both elements in this?
Well, introducing an audience to a period that is 1,200 years ago, it's almost like creating a whole new world because everything was different. My eyes were opened as I was doing the research. It's like an entirely new world. So, in order for my readers to understand the challenges that the protagonists faced, they really needed to understand the world they were living in, including all the political intrigues that infected the royal courts of France, Francia, and Wessex. So, knowing the big picture was essential for me too as an author, so that I could come to some decision as to what their motivations would have been to write those personal
Yeah,
and
you want to
tender
grab the audience,
scenes.
have them care about the characters. Yes.
Exactly. And their actions and choices made sense to me as I began to understand what was going on in their world. And so I tried to alternate those serious discussions, political and personal discussions, with fun glimpses into their personal lives and some of the fun things they did as well. Because if it's all very heavy, I find it's too much. You need some relief, comic relief, if you would.
So in talking about that, about balancing between the characters and introducing the reader to that world. Um, do you rely on a single protagonist, or did you interweave the multiple perspectives to depict the complexity, because it is a very complex time period? How
Yeah.
did you choose to structure that in The Girl of Many Crowns?
Because the story has so much going on in it, The Girl of Many Crowns is told from three different perspectives. The first perspective we encounter is that of Baldwin Iron Arm, the male protagonist. History really hasn't given us a lot of detail because he wasn't royal, and they mainly wrote about royals. Regarding his personal life, we know, well, they presume his father was a count. He becomes a count. They said, no, he was a powerful knight. He was the companion to Louis, Judith's younger brother. And he was successful, one of the few knights successful in fighting Vikings. He had an amazing reputation. So, in fact, the Iron Arm was the reputation that was attached to his name because of that. So, the second perspective, well, actually, let me mention one more thing regarding Baldwin. Because he was the companion of Louis, then I put him in every position that Louis would have been in. He is there with him. I assume he was because he was his companion. And So that allows us to see what's going on in that part of the kingdom during these 7 years. The second perspective is that of Judith, of course, as the female protagonist. And this perspective actually allows us to experience not only her early life in Francia and her marriage, but also she moves to Wessex. So we get to see all the politics, all the dirty dealings going on in England at that time. And the third perspective is that of Hincmar, Archbishop of Reims. Now, Hincmar was the closest advisor to King Charles, and he was quite the manipulator. He learned how to manipulate politics and men, and he was always scheming, but he was also one of the most prolific writers and most influential men of the 9th century. I'd never heard of Hincmar before.
Yeah, I was going to say, who was he? So he seems like a modern day politician.
Yes, I would say very much so. Like the power behind the throne, he really was.
Yeah,
he absolutely was. And so that allows us to see the council tables of King Charles, the political maneuverings, the war, gathering for war, wars going on, that type of thing. So having all three perspectives really gives us a complete picture of those 7 years. And alternating between those perspective also allows readers to kind of identify with whichever protagonist they like. Men who read this book, I found, actually think it's a man's book.
Yeah.
And they love the characters of Baldwin and Hincmar, and they totally relate to them. They think this is an adventure, a high adventure novel. The women who read the book, I never saw it that way. I was surprised when my husband and son saw it that way. And I've had men reviewers always think of it that way, and they love it. But the women who read it invariably identify with Judith and see it as a story of a woman who is finding her own path against seemingly insurmountable odds. And so it's very interesting
So
that
it's a blended
those
genre, historical fiction and romance, or romance or adventure. There.
It's life is what it is. It was real life in the 9th century, 7 years, kind of like The Crown in a way, where you're going year by year for Queen Elizabeth.
So DH, so you have these perspectives, and you're given this whole time period of the 9th century France. It's often referred to as a transitional period. How do you view the evolution of France during this time period after having done all this research?
Well, you can see from the maps that I provide in the book that The Girl of Many Crowns really covers a pivotal time when we go from Charlemagne, her great grandfather, who owned pretty much all of Europe and controlled all of Europe. And then it's broken up into pieces. And now we're starting to see the borders start to take shape of modern Europe. But the conflicts that are there during these 7 years are pivotal because Louis the German is trying to take over Francia. And if he succeeds, there would have not have been a France. It would have all been Germany. So it's very interesting. France, they also, during that time, Francia was seen as the cultural leader. They in writing, in education, they were. And the funny thing is that even up until the mid 1900s, France was still seen as a cultural leader in the world. Now, arguably, America is, but France was the leader of culture and fashion and everything in that day up until the mid 1900s in our day.
Do you see any parallels between the political and social climate of the 9th century France and our modern day here in America, our modern day political struggles? Did you notice any parallels there during your research?
Well, I've noticed that we have a lot of unrest in our own world today, and a lot of different leaders feel surrounded by maybe or threatened by countries that aren't necessarily friendly to them. And yet they have to go out and negotiate with them. They
Yeah.
have to strike a treaty. They have to compromise when the last thing they want to do is compromise with somebody perhaps that they despise or feel like they are a murderer or some, you know, these are the same issues that faced King Charles. He was fighting for his kingdom. He was trying to preserve Francia, which is why he used his children in political marriages, which is why he used everything within his power to try to shore up his kingdom. I also noticed that, again, as we talked about it before, the political marriages issue continued down until very recently. And in some countries, it still exists. Even in Japan, 2020, Princess Mako had to elope or leave in order to marry the person that she loved rather than.
And I think I saw not too long ago,
designated
she's
for her.
actually living in New York.
Yeah.
In New York
That's what I
City.
heard too.
Yeah, and that he just works a 9-to-5 job.
Yeah, I think I heard that it took him 3 times to pass the bar exam, but he did it.
But she loved him.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that's
So
giving
this
him a
book
lot.
really tells what would you give up for your freedom? Would you, I would, after doing this research, I would not want to be a royal. I like my freedom too much, but it's fascinating. Their world was fascinating.
How did you discover this? It says in your bio it was while doing or has this story always been passed down through your family? Were you always aware of this?
Well, actually, how I discovered it was when my husband and I married many years ago. We had an aunt, and I think most people do have an aunt or an uncle who is the genealogist of the family. And she wanted someone to pass this on to. And so, as a wedding gift, she gave my husband and me a genealogy book. And she had an enormous genealogy chart that went back generation after generation on a couple of lines and went back into royalty. And when I looked, she also had family group sheets of all these people. And when I looked at this one, I thought, there's something wrong with this. I said to my husband, this can't be right. We have this young daughter, the princess, at 12 years old, marrying a 50-year-old king. Then a year and a half, 2 years later, she's marrying his son. And then a couple of years after that, she's marrying this count. And it was funny because we come through her first husband, through Alfred the Great, who was her stepson, and becomes her brother-in-law, the second marriage. And then we also come through Judith on this side. And I set out to prove it wrong. I said, there's no way that this girl shows up on 4 different places on my genealogy. There has to be something wrong. So, no, I don't think anyone in our family knew the story because I'd never heard it. They just knew the names. And the more I delved into the story, the more I wanted to find out. And COVID was kind of the catalyst for my finally bringing together research and then just sitting down and researching it completely. And I said, you know, if I don't write her story, who's going to write it? So that was my challenge.
That was your challenge. Yeah, that was your COVID challenge.
Yes.
Well, outside of your own work, DH, are there any books, authors, or historical periods that have influenced or inspired you the most on your personal level?
You know, I've always been an avid reader. Even as a little child, I would just read book after book, and very eclectic in my interests. I love historical fiction. I love the classics. I was determined to read all the classics. I love mysteries. You know, I was probably most in love with, as a young person, Jane Austen, of course, Emily Bronte, those types of books. But I loved reading Shakespeare. I loved reading C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien. I love the Harry Potter series. I love any kind of book that makes me think and is not, every once in a while I'll read a light, fluffy book that I don't have to think too much about. It depends on what kind of mood I'm in. But for me, I want to think about the themes and I want to have to dig a little. And I get great satisfaction out of that.
What now do you anticipate, now that you've finished The Girl of Many Crowns and it's out, do you anticipate any sequels or prequels to The Girl of Many Crowns? Are there any other ghosts in your family tree that that you're interested in writing about and putting into your next book?
Well, I did discover while I was doing the research that Judith's grandmother, who she was named for, the Empress Judith, was a very fascinating character, and she had a very dramatic life. In fact, I've wondered if the myth or the fairy tale of Cinderella story was based on her life or something similar, because she married her husband, the son of Charlemagne and emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. She married him. He was a widower and he was very sad and lonely. And all of his counselors got tired of his moping around. So they sent out a proclamation through the entire empire, which was pretty much all of Europe at that time, to gather all the most talented and beautiful young women for the king to admire, to get to know. And he selected Judith.
Oh, now that is a fairy tale. That is a wonderful story. And that is
once
Cinderella.
they got married, though, and he was a widower, and he was a bit older than she was. She was in her early 20s, and he was in his late 40s. And he had some grown sons. And those sons became very jealous when she had a baby boy.
Oh, okay.
And so she had to run for her life. She had all kinds of intrigue. They locked up their father and put him in prison for a while. They were doing everything they could to try to keep Charles, our young Judith's father, from surviving or from inheriting any part of the kingdom. And she was a very strong woman, and she succeeded. But her story is quite dramatic. And I'm thinking of doing that prequel. I've started doing more research into that, and
so
that's my
that
next book.
would that be the 9th century, or are you going back into the 8th century for that?
It will start in the very last of the 8th century, and continue into towards the middle of the 9th century.
Oh, that will be
Or
fascinating.
maybe the beginning. I haven't decided how I'm going to structure it yet, or it will be, maybe just earlier in the 9th century.
Well, thank you for joining us today, DH. Where can people find The Girl of Many Crowns?
Well, you can go to Amazon, you can go to Barnes and Noble, online. And actually, we're hoping that within the next month or so, we will have an Audible version as well. We're working on that right now.
And that concludes this episode of Authors on iTours. If you enjoyed this episode, then do give us a like and a thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe so that you can receive notifications for upcoming episodes of Authors on iTours. In the meantime, happy reading!